staff with FBI on the need for oversight on their assessment investigations. So this is a matter that we clearly are all focused on, and we've been in touch with the ranking member, Ms. Mace, about pursuing this very question. Okay, thank you, and I will now come to Ms. Pressley, the gentlelady from Massachusetts, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin. I really appreciate your continuing this series of hearings on how we confront violent white supremacy. The federal government certainly has a significant role to play in deterring and ending domestic terrorism at the hands of violent white supremacists. And confronting this threat, I believe, requires law enforcement agencies to recognize how they have contributed to the harm, destabilization, and trauma of Black and Brown communities. In recent years, we have seen white supremacists commit massacres that target people of color, religious minorities, and others, from Charleston, South Carolina, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to El Paso, Texas, to the city of Winthrop in my own home state of Massachusetts. The surge of violent, organized white supremacy knows no bounds and has claimed the lives of far too many of our neighbors. Moreover, federal law enforcement has a well-documented history of attacking these same communities. The truth is, racial and religious profiling and counterterrorism has disproportionately targeted marginalized communities, including Muslims, Sikhs, immigrants, and Black people. As the Biden administration is crafting a more effective domestic counterterrorism policy, we have to not lose sight of the fact that the victims of these violent incidents come overwhelmingly from marginalized communities. Mr. Langan, the FBI is responsible for tracking these domestic terrorism threats across the country. Would you agree that as we see a rise in domestic terrorist incidents, that we also see an increase in the surveillance and the targeting of communities of color being targeted? Yes or no?
So I agree. We have definitely seen a rise of those domestic terrorism cases. And as such, we continue, as brought up on the last point, also continue to be very focused on ensuring that we are addressing the civil rights needs, and it's part of a two-part process and a two-mission.
Mr. Langan, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure you understand my question. I'm just going to reclaim my time, and it's just a yes or no question. As we see an increase in domestic terrorist incidents, do we also see an increase in the targeting and the surveillance of communities of color? Yes or no?
No, I'm not seeing that as far as my data is showing me.
Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. Chair, a study from the Brennan Center titled Countering Violent Extremism in the Trump Era, which estimates that 85% of countering violent extremist grants and over half of the programs targeted minority groups. Mr. Chair? Okay. I assume that's accepted without objection.
Without objection, it's accepted.
Thank you. In the district I represent, the Massachusetts 7th, Somali immigrants living in Roxbury are directly targeted across the country. We see Muslims, Black Lives Matter activists, LGBTQ folks, refugees, and others that are also targeted and subjected to heightened surveillance. These communities are overwhelmingly the victims of domestic terrorism, not the perpetrators. Mr. Cohen, how will the new federal strategy encourage DHS to emphasize the protection rather than the surveillance of these marginalized communities?
So, Congressman, let me just first say, as I alluded to earlier, I agree that there were issues with the CVE program. And in many respects, one of the big issues that we found is that we underestimated the amount of distrust between communities of color, and in particular Arab American and American Muslim communities, and law enforcement. There was a perception that the CVE program, which was started with good intentions, was mainly a subterfuge to facilitate surveillance of communities of color, Arab American and Muslim communities. That's why we've done away with it. That's why the approach that we're taking in the Biden administration is antithetical to the approach that we took as part of the Countering Violent Extremism program. To the second part of your question is we have work to do. I spend a lot of my time each week reaching out and working with state, local law enforcement, but I probably spend an equal amount of time meeting with groups like the Brennan Center, civil rights, civil liberties organizations, advocacy groups, faith-based organizations.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. Let me reclaim my time for a moment there. Mr. Cohen, as we close here, can you share an example, since you're having those broader discussions, of how the counterterrorism strategy has been altered because of feedback that you've received directly from community stakeholders who have traditionally been targeted?
Yes, we've been asked to specifically focus on funding community-based programs that are organized and managed at the community level versus having them organized from Washington or by law enforcement organizations.
Well, it's good to hear about those efforts to engage with those vulnerable communities. And nevertheless, these same communities who are targets of domestic terrorism, they do still appear to be the main focus of many intrusive federal efforts. It's unacceptable for communities of color to bear the brunt of white supremacist violence at the hands of domestic terrorists and to then be disproportionately targeted by federal law enforcement in response to domestic terrorism. So, look forward to these ongoing conversations as you are recalibrating strategy here. And thank you for, a commitment to recognize that violent white supremacy is a systemic threat to our nation, to our democracy, and specifically to marginalized
The gentlelady's
communities.
time has expired.
Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you so much. And the chair now recognizes Representative Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to yield the balance of my time